Hi, this is Jaden Tatum, a PhD student at The Ohio State University, and I want to share today about my design and evaluation of an integrated grain drying and storage system for developing countries. Post-harvest losses of staple grain crops that are an important part of diets, providing 80% of caloric needs for many in developing countries, experience high post-harvest loss rates that can exceed 40%. And those grains are removed from the supply chain with either significant quality or quantity losses due to microbial degradation or pest infestation. Traditional solar drying practices that are used often leave grains vulnerable to dust, weather, and pests. They also may not completely dry grains to the levels needed for safe and long-term storage. Within long-term storage, pests are a huge barrier to grain preservation. And so one technology that's been widely used is hermetic storage, which creates an airtight seal around the grain so that pests living within the grain will use up the remaining oxygen in the environment before population stops growing and they are not able to do damage anymore. But some of these soft-sided hermetic storage technologies may be vulnerable to pests and to puncture during transport, and so they have to be repurchased after a few years, which is a cost to smallholder farmers. So we wanted to investigate if we could find a way both to increase access to improved mechanized drying and to allow for airtight storage in rigid containers that may be more resilient against pests. After a few years of design and development and improvements, this has turned into what we call the Integrated Grain Drying and Storage System, or IGDSS, that I'll be talking about today. So we wanted to complete a holistic evaluation of this system using some principles of human-centered design, so ensuring that the design is technically feasible, that it accomplishes what we mean to improve outcomes during drying and storage, that it's financially viable, that it has appropriate costs and benefits for the context for which it's designed, and that it's actually desirable by end users who we are envisioning as smallholder farmers in developing countries. So the objective of my dissertation research has been to look at all three of these areas for the IGDSS, and today I'll be talking to you about some of that. In this talk, I'm going to discuss some of our design considerations as we've developed and improved the system, and also some of our technical evaluations and results. Moving into design considerations, we followed some tenets of appropriate technology, meaning that we wanted to focus on using locally available materials, like these 55-gallon drums pictured here. Just like I was able to get these reused in Columbus, Ohio, they often are available at low cost in many developing countries because they've had a previous use, but now they're empty, and it's not cost effective to ship them back. We also wanted our system to be easy to construct in country, easy to use, and also to account for varying levels of electricity access. Thinking of the ease of use in our design, our access system shifted from a bottom access, which required a specially constructed stand and crouching, and it required 2 people to access the grain. We shifted to a side access port at the bottom of the barrel that allows the corn to flow out of the system, and it requires minimal disturbance to the barrel. It's an easier system to construct. We just needed a specialty drill bit to drill a hole that a hole plug could fit into. When we brought the system to discussion with some farmers in the Arusha region of Tanzania, we discussed how they were currently getting grain out in communities where they were already storing grain in solid 55-gallon drums. And they showed us how they would tip the barrel over a tire and shake it to get the grain out of the small hole at the top. And they expressed a lot of interest in using a similar side access port. Another aspect of constructability and ease of use, in our very first iteration, our prototype, we had a standalone grain access system, that bottom grain access, and initial dryer that first the grain would go into, be dried, and have to be transferred into a second system. We shifted that into our integrated grain drying and storage system. So we use an on-floor duct to dry the grain, and then also access that grain at the bottom. So it's one system. And it also meant that we shifted away from extensive barrel modifications that required welding and lots of tools to a duct that was more of a drop-in system. And on the right, you can see we also had the opportunity in Tanzania to work with fundi, an artisan who crafted one of these ducts, and told us about the practices and the time and the costs that it would take him to create multiple of these in country for use in his community. Next, moving on to the drying trials. So this study was conducted in Ohio. So we used dent corn from some of our university's research field, but we did dry it in kind of an elevated temperature environment in a greenhouse in Columbus. We monitored the drying progress over time with a handheld moisture meter. We also looked at air pressure around the system because we're using that duct just to ensure evenness of drying. Over our multiple years of trials, we shifted from a heated system that dried grain in under 2 days but had a really high energy use to an unheated system that still took 2 or 3 days, so still less than a lot of the solar drying that's going on currently. And we really minimized that use by doing unheated drying. We also found with our air pressure readings that the air pressure was pretty similar around our system, even though we were using that duct, that it was even throughout the grain body in the barrel. Next, moving on to some of our storage and access trials. So we did want to simulate the storage conditions that might be closer to our area of interest in sub-Saharan Africa. So we stored the grain in a greenhouse at an elevated temperature and also introduced storage pests, so weevils that we reared and inoculated into the grain. Some of the things that we looked at were the changes in moisture content, the temperature and relative humidity within the grain body, and the colony forming units to indicate kind of the mold levels in the system. And we also were concerned about pests. So we looked at the changes in oxygen levels in the barrels over time, what were the observed, live weevils, and what was the crack and breakage and the germination rates of the corn. So here's a quick look. We were rearing weevils in the lab for several generations, making sure they were accustomed to corn again, and then inoculating them at 2 different treatment levels in 2 of our different trials. We compared our system with dried grain with and without bugs, and another system that was not dried grain, but just the moisture content that we had at harvest time, to see kind of a worst case scenario for our system. And we also compared that against more typical hermetic storage trials where the grain was undisturbed for 3 or 6 months. So some of the results from that are relative humidity levels within the barrels. Within 4 of these barrels are shown in these kind of more constrained lines between 40 and 60% humidity. And those are consistently below this red block area that's showing kind of a danger zone for Aspergillus mycotoxin producing fungi. That lines up with what we saw in the lab, looking at the colony forming units, how our wet grain kind of had run away, more mold, but the drier grain did not, even with and without bugs. Our oxygen rates, we saw a drop in the barrel when we first sealed it. And then when we began sampling at these dark lines, you can see some small reintroduction of oxygen into our system. And that when it begins to decrease again, that kind of indicates some of our weevil pressures. The moisture content was maintained over time in our dried system, both with and without bugs, but you can see how it even increases in our wet system. So the IGDSS was doing what it should in terms of maintaining that moisture content for safe storage. Colony forming units, yes. So we were able to, over many years, work on a design that became easier to use and used lower energy. And we also found that it was able to maintain grain quality throughout storage. I want to thank all of the university resources that helped me in this study, and I will stop for questions now. Thank you.